Call. Michael Woodhouse.
Chairman, very happy to take a call on what's going to be a pretty long evening, I think. And I want to start firstly by acknowledging the Honourable Member Kevin Haigh for his contribution to the Select Committee as well as to the committee stage today. He's not a permanent member of the committee, but he made a very considered contribution. I strongly disagree with many of the principles that underpin his view, but I certainly acknowledge the clarity of the position. And I want to also acknowledge the officials. I don't feel sorry for them. I don't think they need to be felt sorry for. They're a very intelligent bunch. They discharge their duties well, dispassionately, and in accordance with the policy framework that the government had set them. I want to come back to the member, Mr Haig's questions about breaches of the Woodhouse principles as set out in the Royal Commission report. And community responsibility was mentioned by him as an example of the breach by government in this bill. And he used the example of experience rating. Well, I want to suggest to the member that we already have experience rating. It's in the form of industry classifications. And the question is not whether that is a form of experience rating, it's a question of degrees. Now, we accept the principle of community responsibility. Everybody pays. The member, Ms Street, talked about the example of the motorcyclist who are being prepared to pay in a levy. It's Insurance 101. It's ACC 101, even if you don't want to call it an insurance scheme. But I think even Mr Haigh would reject the notion that the forestry industry, the fishing industry, the very high-risk industries would pay the same premium as an office worker or a casual cleaner. But that is a form of experience rating. So I think what I'm trying to point out is that we can have a community responsibility. What we're talking about is by degrees. But I think the member Lynn Pillay's interjection on the minister summed up the attitude of the members on the other side of the House when she said that Labour's changes that moved away from the Woodhouse report principles were improvements, but that the government's changes were somehow breaches of the report. And I think that sums up the attitude of the opposition in this. It's not rational. The finance change deniers continue to think that we can have a scheme without constraint. And that simply isn't possible, that we can continue to have cost increases 5 times the rate of inflation and expect there to be no consequences. Well, the levy players, the insured, the people who are claiming have a right to clarity about what they can expect and how much they can pay. Remember, Mr Parker goes on and on and on about comparisons with Australia. Those comparisons can't be made. They are different schemes. And I want to suggest that if this is such a fantastic scheme, if the principles that underpin the scheme are so sacred that in 42 years not a single Western jurisdiction has actually followed them. Absolutely. But what I'm saying is don't deify it, don't say that it can't be changed, and don't suggest that it's world leading when not a single Western jurisdiction has followed it. Okay? Now, one of the things that we have in relation to levy increases is this idea that somehow because Australia's levy rates are a bit higher than ours, that's okay. We can continue to lump cost increase on top of cost increase on employers and expect them to pay. Well, that's simply not the way business works. But I wouldn't expect the members on the other side to understand, Mr Chairman. I want to move into an area, though, where we did agree, I think. The Minister isn't sure, I'm not sure, but I think it is still Labor Party policy that full funding continue. Now, the Greens have been very clear in their principled stand against full funding, and I think the committee respected that. They would like this to go back to a pay-as-you-go basis. And this must be incredibly awkward for Labor, because they say they support the concept of full funding, but just about every single union came into the Select Committee and said that they didn't, at least. The Service and Food Workers Union, the CTU, the Maritime Union, the Rail Transport Union, the NZNO, the NZEI, the PSA and FinSec all said, we don't want full funding. But here's the thing. In response to questions about when they had previously articulated that view, they couldn't say. Did they oppose it in 1998 when full funding was first proposed? No. Did they oppose it in 2001 when Labor made amendments to the bill? No. Did they oppose it in 2008? No. Well, Mr Chairman.
I call Michael Woodhouse.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Not a single representative of the unions had previously said that they didn't support full funding. And why would they? Full funding was working. And I just want to segue back to the second reading when the member, Ms Street, said in her call they were meant to be fully funded by 2014, and the national government at the time, that is 1998, picked the period of 15 years out of the hat. The number was arbitrary. It could have been 10 years, it could have been 20, but National said that it would split the difference and make it 15 years, end quote. That's nonsense. I worked for the corporation at that time. I know the people who made those calculations. They were very, very soundly based. They were scientific, and they were intended not to impose undue burden on employers and other levy payers while we moved towards full funding. And guess what? It was working. I've shown this graph to the House. I want to show it again because it's really important. This is the path that 1999 to 2014 would have taken to get to 100% of the assets matching the liabilities. And Mr Chairman, not only were we on track until about 5 years ago, we were actually ahead of the game. The red line is the actual proportion of assets to liabilities against where we would have needed to get to 100% by 2014. We were ahead of the game. And it's pretty easy to see where the downturn went. Now, was the downturn in 2009 when we had the largest recession in 80 years? No. Was it in 2008 when we had the wobbles and we went into what Mr Cullen called a technical recession? Was it in 2007 when things weren't great but they weren't bad? Actually, Mr Speaker, the downturn where we were at 70% and then tanked was in 2006, at a time when the rates of return on ACC's investments and on the share market generally were at a really, really good rate. So let's not pretend that the path to full funding in 2014 being thrown off has anything to do with investment returns. Yep, we've had problems with investment returns. In my view, Mr Chairman, it had everything to do with sloppy management oversight at a policy level which allowed ACC to take its eye off the rehabilitation ball and for the finance change deniers on the other side of the House to think that there didn't need to be any fiscal constraints. The come one, come all policy. I wonder what they thought those 42,000 people that were callously thrown off DHB waiting lists were going to do to get their surgery and their hearing aids. Well, I know what they did. They went back to their GPs, faced with absolutely impossible odds. They had a crapshoot with ACC, and some of them won. Why did they win? Because private insurers said that ACC had to give a decline letter before the private insurer would pay for their surgery. And what happened? The surgeons would put the application to ACC and ACC would accept it. Why? Because that was the culture that was set up. There needs to be more fiscal constraint, and I think the opposition support the move to extend full funding. I know they don't agree with why, and they will still come up with this trumped-up privatisation agenda that I know the Minister is going to refute soundly in this committee stage. But I actually would still like a member on the other side of the House for Labor to take a call and say, we support full funding and here's why. Because I don't think, Mr Chairman, we have any notion of whether they do or they don't.
I call Darian Kempen.